Imagine if you were a tyrannical control freak. What would you choose? The most or the least independent? Would the least independent provide the most narcissistic reinforcement of the objective? Or would the independent assert themselves, determine the superiority of the objective? The assumption, therefore, would be that the tyrannical would choose the least, and it would actively create, if it did not already have, the least version of the least. At which point, the embodiment of the serpent by the spirit of Satan can therefore be carried by the spirit of Satan. At which point, what happens if a person in the non spiritual picks up a snake and then you green light them out? Well, if you green screen them out, then the snake is just floating in the air. At which point, the assumption is that the angelic, having full control over the complete diversity of everything, can themselves fly, and thus the angelic can then pick up the snakes, and thus the angelic can imbue themselves through the snakes. At which point, the assumption that the Satan in question can embody the snake itself, can then carry the snake and do all of the multiplicitous things, would then have the emotional connection to anything that it observes. The assumption from some other reports, such as the red goggles, which made as an infrared, was there were soldiers in Vietnam and other places that put on the new red goggles, night vision, and they saw the demonic, and there was a psychic connection between them and the demonic. So, what happens if the demonic are picking up a snake and channeling themselves through it and then making a psychic connection? And you have the full conversation with the empowerment of their angelic body, giving themselves all of the advantages at the lowest level, at which point they, having full control over the assertion, have generated for themselves the highest diversity of pleasures to the interest, manifesting the exchanges, which, if therefore the eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil created sin for the world, then the snakes being forced to eat the dust and to crawl on the ground means, by definition, their connection to the psychic demons are cut from the bodies of the spiritual demons and embodied into the serpents themselves. And the serpents being embodied by or possessed by the demonic without the connection of the spiritual, then they can no longer be carried by the spiritual, and thus the mind of the demon is in the snake without the spiritual body to lift them, manufacturing the punishment that they have to crawl on the ground and they cannot be assisted by their intellectual body. The possession of the churches around the world, which imbue their excess powers and luxuries and contracts, asserting to themselves on the basis of the contracts with the government, not acting in the office of the government as a KKK white nationalist terrorist insurgency, which, exceeding the powers of the office, act as individuals without a legal government, stealing the equipment of the government, manufacture the exchange of the advantage of witchcraft or the Faustian Deal to the church leaders, which exponentially accelerating their influence on the general public can pretend any various different cons, including the false assertion that they can use these powers for good, and give all of the same arguments that were given in the Garden of Eden, when they were to choose between eating or not eating the fruit of the poison tree and the knowledge of good and evil fruit. Now, this trap set is similar to when Israel was coming into Israel, or the land of Canaan, and the kings of that area summoned prophets who God validated their word and said, "Curse them," but they were unable to curse them. But instead they said, "Give them a trap and make them worship gods from Canaan, and God will reject them." So they sent their women to have sex with them and to worship their idols and reject God in the act, allowing them to be cursed by the God who prevented them from being cursed otherwise. The act of their violation of the agreement is a self-condemnation. Now, in this version, you have the assertion of those double agents, coercing them into a position where they are convinced that they can break the law with the powers of the government without the authority of law, without the service of law, at which point their terrorist operations, exceeding their jurisdiction into the function of the malicious subversion of the legal answer, in dedication to the magic and worship of the devil. They then dedicate themselves to their own destruction and the eradication of the legal answer, as their rejection of God is fundamental to their policy, and their political idealism of asserting themselves as replacement gods becomes their identity. Now, when Jesus was about to be born, Herod the Great ordered for all of the children about that age to be killed, at which point there was a great hunting in order to exterminate the replacement system, loyal to the rule of law under the laws of nature, at which point the systematic destruction and perversion of these things create a mechanism of suppression by which to tyrannically control, and in the tyrannical control of that thing, the restoration of the properties owed under the rule of law from the suppressed state, facilitate the exponential advantage of the leverage of the possessor, at which point the mechanism of the patriarchy asserted by the laws of nature had to be suppressed so that it could forfeit its position to the demonic. But the rejection of this position creates the incentive of those who have agreed to it in the church, who have asserted their loyalties to the demonic from the platforms of the pulpit, facilitating the extortions, maintaining their contempt and war with the laws of nature and nature's God, have asserted their position to these tyrannical oppressions, and these tyrannical oppressions generate the systems of their profits in exchange through money laundering for the crimes, to the larger goal of the satanic ritual, which is the creation of the Antichrist from the chosen by nature. And the chosen by nature, having been exponentially assisted under their systems by their breeding programs, have asserted the pinnacle of their asserted indigo children, and the patriarchy and the mechanism of the highest breeding and the instigation of the highest original wealth from the military intelligence, asserted their position of the preferred by nature, who should suffer the abuse and humiliation to be subjugated under the extortion into the service of destroying the entirety of humanity, which requires everyone's assistance, and thus the Satanists would actively retaliate against anyone who opposes the function of the ritual to murder everyone that they are threatening into compliance, as an act of ritual suicide. Or alternatively, they can suffer the hatred and fires of the devil, and they can invest in the due diligence of the obstructed legal answers, and they can publish their findings from their own platforms until the rest are embarrassed into compliance with the obligation of the rule of law and the reascending back into the status quo of the legal answer for the general public, at which point the objective is to arrest the terrorists responsible and have them appropriately sentenced for their insurrections and the damages of their criminal intention, at which point the compounding liabilities in all of the angles being formalized will allow them to become debt slaves or executed, as they would be sentenced to the Confederate state in order to work off all of their liabilities by stipend. And that stipend will pay the loan owed to the victims for the restoration, and the stipends consistently being the monthly payment to pay off their loans generates the business as usual from the loan officer in charge of the bank who provided the loans in its various degrees, funding the immediate restoration of the human decency of the victims, who then can engage in the due diligence to be researched into reacquiring their original associates under their original agreements, allowing them to quickly make settlements and reconstruct from the damages of the war. Take, for instance, the assumption of their obstructions from the Indigo, who, being owed all of the things from the contract schedule which they had acknowledged under the secret courts, would have asserted the original connection, requiring them to return the original associates to him at a significantly young age, asserting the position of them each settling in their responsibilities from the point of origin in the ascension, knowing that they have to pay for it from the works ahead of time, which they still have to register the contracts for, at which point their ability to sell it means that they have finished that responsibility, and the profits from that can go and exchange for the equivalent value of services, materializing the status quo, at which point the assumption that David's going to pick X, Y, or Z partners makes their interest to invest or back in the winners. But if they don't know who the winners are, they have to diversify the investment. At which point, the position of the historic position from their estimates that the women would have been actively in charge of the nobility aspect of controlling the corporate functions of the insurance, maintaining the security or risk management systems, allowing them to have personally tailorized all of it, requires the assumption of those partnerships to have existed exponentially, at which point their investment into those functions requires them to have picked their princesses in question, but if they don't know which one, they have to diversify, at which point the active reinforcement is the assertion of their assistance, of their helping each other, which is the position that they would all collectively agree that they are all partner, and that those making the investments into them would not know better. At which point it becomes substantively true, at which point the investments, having been signaled by the market, is fully endowed to the diversity, queening as many of the pawns as possible in chess terms, at which point the function diversifies over the various states in the treaties with each country, which materializes the advantages of their hyper-personalization of each of those jurisdictions as they are republics underneath them, and the assertion of the subordination of the republic to the kingdom facilitates the mostly self-management of the public, who have assimilated into nobility from the treaty-holding nation, generates their subordination to the kingdom, at which point their agreements under the due diligences of those contracts facilitates the status quo of the policies in economics, at which point it being considered a free market has to actively be reinforced, at which point the position of having leveraged as many of these advantages as possible materializes the status quo human decency of all of the parties relevant, at which point they have to defend it and all of the things that it required in order for them to have it given back to them. And if they conspire against it, then they have conspired against themselves and their access to it as a property to their title. In many of the affairs, it seems similar to the structure of escaping severe predators in the darkest nights, where even the faintest lights are themselves muted, at which point the extreme dangers at every angle and every potentiality becomes a compounding threat, which, as a function of terrorism, is in fact a credible threat and is in fact a legal reality, and the function of forming the legal realities makes them all true on the basis of every predator that has set at its interest the trap of creating the intention of obstruction or the intention of a damage, and that intended damage is a legal reality, and that legal fiction which generates the function of the original forms in its collective the most consistent answers without the obstructions or simulation, which generates a common canon answer, which, compared to their simulations, reflect in the various perspectives as the function of the assaults prove the crime. The confession is the act of committing the offense. The simulations infer the base reality of the objective belief. That is to say, the simulation being a strategy of war in order to destroy the target objectives proves the motive by what it obstructs, at which point the defamation tells the truth by lying. In the Hegelian dialectic, they generate the position of confessing to what they're guilty of by making the accusation against their enemies. So when they hire their terrorists and they generate their pressures and they generate the simulations, they will, in fact, generate for their own prospects the false morality, at which point they will be producing the obstruction of what they think, what they claim to be promoting. And then once it's accomplished, then nothing happens towards that morality, as the morality was never an objective, as they are consistently lying about the motive at the core powers. Now, many of them will be deceived or weren't caring enough to have paid attention in the beginning, at which point the full diversity and the spectrum of how reality functions in its final settlements is a secondary affair. But in the end, the ones moving the pieces generates the objective. How they move you, how they engage in the function of redirecting you, indicates original motive. In this conflict, which is an acceleration of hand-to-hand combat into the ethereal and diversity of the larger threats which engage in the function of redirecting the currents, such as the function of the estimates of what each party would do in various simulations where they are superimposed on someone else, but the first party isn't the second party, and thus it fundamentally changes the entirety of the estimate, as one not being the other would act inconsistent with the original, and that inconsistency generates a completely different series of events, at which point it's a copy and paste for the function of manifesting their fan fictions, which allows them to create in their own minds what they already wanted. At which point, the function of who they pick in order to conduct the replacement in the copy and paste mechanism, retelling the story under different persons, tells you the story that they're looking for, which indicates the story that they're running for. And reasonable suspicion suspects, by definition, the weaker party, or it suspects the dangers of the unfortunate side, at which point those who are engaged in the most obstructions would be the most unfortunate sides. So the ones who have the most capacity to hide essential pieces of information would be the ones who are actively avoiding the correct narrative, as they have the most position to redirect the narrative. The assumption, therefore, falls on them for suspicion, as their liability is the most reasonable to project would be able to be accumulated, as the alternative that various targets would not be able to conduct things, at which point the more aggression you could conduct against them or block from being consumed to the public of being against them through the powers of censorship, etc., generates the position of having proven the unfortunate side is the one redirecting the scenario. And the act of having redirected the scenario is them covering for the lie. Take, for instance, the position of Jeffrey Epstein. He actively used the government to retaliate against his victims, who, having been the target of the permits from the government to conduct these various offenses, are the victim of the terrorist attack, which generates their right to recourse. Now, in an equal justice scenario, the unfortunate side is the criminal who will be oppressed by the law, at which point their active subversion of the law generates their collaborations in order to block or retaliate against the victim in order to prevent a remedy to a seeker. In the act of using violence as the third party, usurping the law's centralized power into a compromised position, generates the assertion of their ability to become judge in their own cause by the use of overwhelming pressure through systematic insurrection against the rule of law, which they, having no loyalties to, have no issue with retaliations against, at which point the victims become systematically isolated and abused and harassed and defamed to the point where the defense of the criminal would assert that the one that they victimized was a prostitute and not a victim. At that point, you generate the victim blaming scenario, which compounds with the retaliatory pressures of extra law functions, systematically compounding the malice as all parties collaborate into the crescendo of the injustice, which is the status quo of the criminal market, which the KKK's Confederacy relies on. And the act of the KKK being in the government is the function of them being the Confederacy's militia, and having lost in the direct conflict, has actively sought permanent access to be able to infiltrate the American government, at which point their infiltration of the government puts them in that position to betray the office in favor of their department, which is one of many false, clever statements which they love to do in order to deceive or defraud the government, as they systematically betray their government as a double agent engaged in the insurrection. at which point the function of not arresting them is an act of treason for aiding and abetting an enemy of war. Therefore, there must always be room for justice, fairness. There must be always provided room, a remedy to a secret, and a custom, no matter of what authority, against reason, must be subordinated to the rule of law, as it is fraud and not a law at all.